Right, and welcome everybody to our 4 o'clock talk with Dr. Ullman, and she will be speaking on dumpster fires, 6 things about IR I learned by being a firefighter. And with that, I'll turn it over to you.
All right. Thank you so much, Kyle. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much to B-Sides and Converge for having me here. We're going to talk a little bit about firefighting and incident response and some things that I learned about those things because I have been a firefighter for a number of years. And I'm going to tell you a little story that goes along with this, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. I know that questions, you can go ahead and throw questions in the chat at any time. We're going to wait to the end to answer them, but I know as somebody who has that burning question, and then I go to ask the question, I forget what it is. I'm one of those folks, so I get it, and please feel free to throw questions in whenever. So here we go. This is our agenda for today. So I'll start talking a little bit about incident response, what it is. We'll talk a little bit about firefighting, incident response versus firefighting, some differences and some similarities. And then we'll get into the 6 things, which I've broken into challenges and opportunities. So things that I see as problematic and things that that we need to be careful of, and things that are opportunities in the sense that we can learn something from this, and it's a good thing. I'll summarize and give some final thoughts. So here to kind of extend the intro is a little bit about me. So for any of you who've never heard me talk or met me at Converge or maybe GERCON or a variety of other conferences, because you'll see I actually, I've done a lot of speaking. I volunteer with some things. I'm on the staff of B-Sides Rochester and UB Gen Cyber Camp. I also help with something called CPTC, which is a collegiate pen test competition. I have some certs, I have some degrees, and that's enough about that. This is the background that fewer of you might know about me. I am a firefighter with Citizens Hose Company, which is here in Lancaster, New York. And I've also been a state fire instructor. I used to be a fire investigator. I'm certified in a number of areas, but this is who I am. So not only do I do incident response for a living, but I am actually a firefighter. And in case you don't buy it, here's a picture of me in my gear, standing next to our captain, holding what is called a thermal camera. So the thing that I'm looking through basically shows you different colored images, and by different colors, I just mean in this particular camera's case, they're different shades of light and dark. So you can see, for example, when something is warm, it's going to be lighter in color, and when something is dark, it's cooler. And the idea is that you can help find either stuff that's, on fire, or you can find maybe humans, because humans are going to be warm, but they're going to be cooler than maybe an actual fire situation. So we use these cameras for that purpose. But this is a picture from a fire that took place about a year ago. So, and this is the story that we're going to get into in a little bit. So let's start really with incident response. And many of you may know what this is, but for any of you who are new to incident response, or maybe even new to security, I wanted to make sure I covered this topic. So what is incident response? Well, incident response is where we're going to address these events, right? It's all of these technical components that are required in order to analyze the content and contain an incident. And this is a little different from incident handling, which we'll see in a minute. But it can be proactive, it can be reactive, it's anything that's going to affect that, what we call the CIA triangle. So that confidentiality, the integrity, and or availability of that information on your network. And the goals of an incident response, we're going to make sure that we know that there is, in fact, an incident happening. We want to stop the attacker, minimize whatever damage is called, and we want to prevent future attacks or similar incidents, right? This is pretty straightforward. And this is our phases. These are our phases of incident response. So we're going to prepare, and then we're going to identify, we have something happening. We're going to try to stop it, get rid of it, recover, and hopefully learn some lessons from it. And this is really what we mean by these different phases. So For preparation, what we're really talking about is, documenting our environment. Like, where are the crown jewels on our network? Where do we have things? Many operations don't even know where the keys to their kingdom actually are. And that's really important, both from a defensive perspective and from an offensive perspective, right? If you're doing a pen test, for example, and you don't really know, you don't really understand those keys to the kingdom, that's going to make your job a lot more difficult. And another part of preparation is going to be tool building. We're also going to do identification. We're going to be aware of these attacks, and sometimes we use a variety of tools to identify them. It could be some sort of an alert trigger, anything that tells you something's going on. It could be a human giving you a call and saying, hey, this isn't normal, this is a problem. Then we're going to stop it by, we might patch it. We might pull out the power, unplug the cord. We might, block communications with a C2. So something along those lines. Then we want to get rid of the bad actor, right? Or actors by remediating. We might take it off the network, completely wipe the box. We might just remove those compromised hosts and put them aside for later. And then recovery is going to be restoring those business functions. So let's get back to normal. Let's get things, fully working again. And then ideally, we want to learn some lessons from all of the things that we've just experienced, because boy, I don't know about you, but I don't want to do that twice, right? I mean, I do incidents all the time, but the point is, if you learn something from one response, ideally it should mean that information prevents that same kind of response in the future if you can. So incident handling, I mentioned, is just a little different. And it's really about logistics and communication and coordination, as opposed to getting your feet in the mud doing the work. And in small organizations, your incident response and your incident handling are going to be the same person or people, because that's all you have. If, however, you can delegate these two roles in two different places, this makes life much easier, because if you're the person who's doing that response, you don't want to be the person who's being poked every few minutes saying, how's it going? Where are we? How's it going? Where are we? Right? You want to delegate that to somebody else who's providing that communication, so that you really only have to facilitate getting that job done. And that's why we say, ideally it's a separate role. All right, so now that we have a sense of, incident response and what we do and what our roles are, let's talk about firefighting. So firefighting, as you might expect, is we want to make sure that we prevent the spread of fires. We extinguish unwanted fires in buildings, vehicles, woodlands, wherever they happen to be. And I mention unwanted because I don't know about you, but somebody who, let's say, has a fire pit in their backyard and they're toasting some marshmallows, I don't think we want firefighters to show up and put that fire out. So we specify, obviously, that these are unwanted fires. We have some goals, much like with IR. In this case, we want to protect the health and safety of ourselves and of the public. And our safety really has to come first, because if we don't protect ourselves, we can't very well protect the rest of you. We want to protect public and private property and, of course, the environment. If we have a situation where something is on fire or leaking, we don't want what our folks do to make that worse and cause damage to the environment. And we also need to minimize disruption of community activities. So if there's, for example, an accident somewhere where a car is on fire and we're dealing with that, we don't want that to stop people from getting to where they need to go. We just want to make sure they do it safely. So there's also a preparedness cycle involved in firefighting, just like there is in incident response. The stages are just a little different, as you can see here. So if we break these down, mitigation in the fire service is really about prevention. So we're going to keep these things from even happening in the first place. And we're going to do that through things like smoke detectors and sprinkler systems, and providing these tools that, mean that there's less chance of there being a fire at all. We're going to make sure that we're prepared to ultimately respond to whatever the incident is. So we need to have pre-plans. Remember I mentioned with the documentation that you do an incident response? Well, as firefighters, we need to do something very similar. We need to understand the nature of what is out in our environment that we're protecting. We need to make sure that our gear is properly maintained, whether it's the gear that we wear, or like the thermal camera that you saw the picture of, or in our trucks and all the rest of our equipment. Then the response involves, getting to an emergency safely and then saving property and lives. Recovery, of course, is recovering from that emergency. We do cleanup, we do restoration and repairs, because remember that even once we leave whatever scene and folks need to deal with the recovery and cleanup of their property, we have to do the same thing with our equipment and our tools. So we have to make sure that our tanks are full of water, that our hoses are repacked in the truck, that any tools that have been damaged are either replaced or fixed or whatever we need to do with them. Things of that nature. So this is going to be kind of the beginning of the story I'm going to tell you. And I want you to take a look. I know that this is a little dark, but if you look carefully, you'll see two firefighters here, one behind the other, and the one in the back is me. And what I'm doing here is I'm replacing an air bottle. Firefighters wear what are called self-contained breathing apparatus, and that involves a bottle and a harness. And the bottles are air bottles, and they're typically somewhere in the neighborhood of 30 to 45-minute bottles, although there are bottles that have more and there are bottles that have less. And when a firefighter starts to run out of air, ideally they're out of the building or out of the structure or whatever they're putting out at this point, and they need a new one. And so one of my jobs at this particular fire was taking the bottle out of the pack and replacing it. So here I am at this particular fire, and I'm just doing my job. I am replacing the bottle in this pack. And we're going to see how this plays into a problem. And I learned something from that problem. So keep this in mind. We'll come back to it. All right, so the last thing in firefighting I want to talk about is something called the incident command system. And I think a version of this could be very useful in incident response, although we don't formally have anything now. So what the incident command system is this organized response to a problem. It's a standardization and a way that you can distribute resources such that folks don't get overwhelmed. It allows for coordination of emergency response with this hierarchy. And here's what it looks like. So you have whoever is considered the incident commander. They're the person kind of in charge of the whole shebang. And it's often the fire chief, but it might not be depending on who is at the particular fire. And then we have some other roles, including safety officer, public information officer, sometimes a liaison, and then these other sections that deal with finance and logistics, etc. So breaking that down, your incident commander is going to define your broader incident goals and your operational objectives. So here's what we're going to try to do. But your operations folks, they're going to be in charge of strategy. So what approach are we going to take to put that fire out? And what actions, what tactics are we going to actually use to do it? Logistics is exactly what it sounds like. Sometimes, especially in larger incidents, we need additional personnel. We need other fire departments to come to our aid. We need more folks from our own fire department. We need more trucks. We need other kinds of equipment. So especially in a larger incident, we have somebody who manages that. And then if you have something that is long-term, let me use something like Katrina, for example. So firefighters get called in to deal with these larger incidents. You might have somebody who's in charge of planning, because you both have to mobilize and demobilize these large groups of people. And then, of course, you have your admin finance person. And again, this is going to be more relevant in these larger scenes where you need specific kinds of licenses. You have to deal with regulation compliance and money and those kinds of things. So let's look at the difference and some similarities between these two and see how one sort of overlaps with the other. So we'll start with the methodologies. While the terms are in slightly different order, we can see a pattern here, right? They're really pretty similar. They all have these stages. And although formally firefighting doesn't officially have like a lessons learned phase, I don't know anybody in the fire service who walks away from a fire and hasn't learned something from it. I mean, maybe they don't take what they've learned to heart, but I would say, especially in successful departments, lessons learned is equally as important as an incident response, right? So the methodologies are not dissimilar. There are also some, I think, interesting misconceptions about these two. So with incident response, not every event is an incident, but yet there are a lot of people who think that, in fact, that is the case. And we don't, in fact, handle every incident the same way. It's going to depend very much on the incident. We might have a framework that we use in terms of, certain steps, but the size and the scope and the individuals and the systems involved could make that very different. We certainly don't solve every incident quickly. Some take longer, some take less. And I can tell you from firsthand experience, not every person on our team needs to be a rock star. No rock star here. I just do the best I can. It's also the case that accurate attribution can be very difficult. So people sometimes assume that, we can always go back and figure out exactly who done it. Yeah, not so much. Now, in terms of firefighting, there are these misconceptions that firefighters are always paid. Well, I can tell you, I have been in the fire service for 20 some years. I started in 1997 and I have never been paid a dime. I'm a volunteer firefighter. Most of the area around here, except for the major metropolitan cities like Buffalo, New York, and Niagara Falls, they're paid. Everybody else is volunteer. We don't make a dime. We do everything we do because it's something we enjoy and we love giving back to the community. I can also tell you with absolute certainty that firefighters are not always big, tough dudes. Not a dude, not big and tough. There are lots of folks in the fire service of all different shapes and sizes, and there's a job for everyone. One of the folks that I learned from early on said that to me, and it stuck. And I think we'll see that, that's not so dissimilar with certain incidents, right? We can find folks who are really good at certain parts of an incident, but maybe they're not so good in others. Certainly not every fire is quickly extinguished. You get a really large fire, it can take a really long time. And firefighting, it's not always a full-time job. You can see my full-time job is doing incident response for the University of Buffalo and other associated forensic analytics and other things of that nature, but I do firefighting on the side. So, we've seen some differences, right? IR doesn't usually involve life safety. Now, in healthcare, and obviously we've seen, especially with these cases in healthcare, where there has been ransomware, where that could, in fact, be a problem. And with all these devices, right, these medical devices. But generally speaking, we're not dealing with life safety. IR teams are typically paid. That's something we get money for, except in very specific cases. We use computers and software, whereas firefighters, we've got to wear special gear. I wear t-shirts and this sort of stuff to do my IR stuff in. We, as firefighters, we show up in fire trucks. Don't need a special vehicle for incident response typically. And your typical firefighter is going to use some sort of some sort of water, foam, chemicals to put out the fire. And, our IR team is using those computers and software. Now, where are they similar? Well, in both cases, we're going to focus on that immediate issue first, right? So with that fire, you have that immediate, life safety, perhaps, something with the property that you need to address first, whether you actually have the buildings on fire, maybe cars on fire, and we're not going to do an investigation into the cause until much later. We're going to use something called triage to determine the best course of action. And for those of you unfamiliar, the idea behind triage is that you take a look at all of the different concerns that you have. So it comes from the emergency medical services, where if you have multiple patients and you have to decide, okay, who are we going to treat first? How are we going to address, more than one person at a time? It's the same idea. So if I have 3 victims of a car accident, and one is, looks like he's bleeding out, and another might be have a bump to the head, and another one's walking around. Well, each one of those is a very different circumstance, and the one who may be maybe we can't save them. And while it may appear that they are top priority, if realistically we can save the other two, and there's really nothing we could do to save that third person, that maybe that isn't who we want to work on first. So that's this idea of triage. And we do the same thing in incident response, right? Especially if we walk into a large scene where multiple systems have been compromised, we can't just go and tackle it all. We have to break it down and decide which requires our attention first. They're both cyclic in nature. We have to have documentation, some sort of pre-planning, ideally, because if we don't, then we don't really know what we're walking into. And they both require some thinking outside the box. One of my favorite stories is that in terms of firefighting, so one of the things I didn't really mention with firefighters, we not only save people and protect them from fire, but there are some firefighters that will help when folks are stuck, for example. And I have a friend who was dealing with a very large individual in a very small room, and that person was in medical distress. They were unable to get this individual out using the standard tools. So he went to the hardware store and he bought some equipment and he built something, and they were able to get that individual out the door. But it took some thinking outside the box. And I know as an incident responder, I frequently use tools that maybe weren't meant for incident response. Maybe that wasn't really their intent, but they give me insight into something I might not have known otherwise. So we also have to sometimes think outside the box. We sometimes have to bring in outside entities. So in the fire service, we bring in other departments to do mutual aid because maybe it's the middle of the workday and there really aren't enough people here. And in incident response, maybe we need to bring in, we need to bring in folks from another agency with expertise in a particular area, maybe ransomware that we don't have, or malware analysis. So that's very common. And in terms of inside teams, so there are certain organizations, sometimes this is in factories, where they'll have their own firefighters because it's a risk, and getting the local fire department to get there and save folks would take too much time. And the same thing goes for incident response. Sometimes you have inside and sometimes you have outside folks. So those are some similarities. All right, so let's move to these 6 things. This is where we're really going to get into the meat of this. So let's talk about the first challenge. The first challenge is tunnel vision. So tunnel vision is this idea. We're going to focus so much on one single thing that we don't see the bigger picture. And as a result, that can mean that we're going to make incorrect, inappropriate, maybe even a dangerous decision. So let's look at a couple of examples. Remember this picture on the left? Hopefully this looks familiar from earlier in my talk. So again, what was I doing here? I was changing an air bottle. Now I want you to look at the picture on the right. This is from the same scene, just slightly different angle. And if you look very carefully, you will notice there's blackening on his coat. And unbeknownst to me, the shoulder harness and the hose, the silver hose that you can kind of see that goes down to where that bottle is, right over here. Hopefully you can see me pointing. That was damaged. And when I went to take, I turned off the bottle, I turned off the air, I disconnected it, I removed it, and then I put in a new bottle, and I connected it, and I turned it on, and I got blasted with air in the face. And why did that happen? Because I wasn't paying attention to the bigger picture. I missed something. I missed something really important because I had tunnel vision. Now, thankfully, in this particular case, I was wearing all of my gear. I had my face shield down at the time, and it wasn't a really big deal. But this pack had to go out of service at that point. But it could have been a big deal. So, real world example. Here's another one from that same fire. What are those cones protecting? If you look carefully, you might see some hose, and you might think that's in fact what those cones are protecting. But imagine if you're a firefighter and you pull up to the house, right? You pull up and you get out, and you're standing right where this picture is taken, and you see there's another, you can see if you look carefully, there's a firefighter at the door, and obviously there's big plumes of black smoke coming out. Well, you might make a beeline for that door. The problem is, and what those cones are protecting that's very difficult to see, are that there were electrical wires down. And if you had gone pell-mell up to try to help that other person at the door, you could have gotten fried. And that is another example of tunnel vision in the fire service that can become quite dangerous. Now, do we have things like that in incident response? Absolutely. And we can have scenes that are not safe. The number one thing we are taught in the fire service and in any of the emergency services is to ask ourselves, is the scene safe? And that really does go for incident response too, because I don't know about you, but incidents come in all shapes and sizes. And I've certainly seen incidents that involve things like the picture on the left, where you have a room that has asbestos in it, and maybe that's where you're responding to, and it didn't even occur to you. Or maybe you go waltzing right into a server room and you think, oh, it's a server room. What's there to worry about here? And have you ever seen a rat's nest of wires in a server room? I know I have, and there are tripping hazards, and there can be electrical hazards, and maybe there's flooding. So consider when you go in, don't focus so much. Don't get that tunnel vision that you're focused so much on, I got to get in and do my thing, that you completely ignore the safety of the scene that you're walking into. Also consider some things that are not perhaps as obvious. You're told that you're walking into an incident and you're told it's malware. If you go into that situation and you just, it's malware and that's what you're thinking, and it turns out to be misconfiguration, you might in fact waste time, you might ruin, you might lose out on some resources, you might ruin whatever evidence you have. Maybe you're so, focused on this that you go and you do blind hardware acquisition. So you go in and you pull a drive and you realize after the fact it was either the wrong thing or you pulled it before, I don't know, getting the key you needed to unlock the data. And a similar to the malware misconfiguration, you're told that something's ransomware, and now you're hyper focused on it being ransomware, but it turns out it's just a phishing email. So having tunnel vision is really, really problematic. All right, so a second challenge that's related to that is reactionary behavior. We not only get hyper focused, but we react, right? This is really normal human behavior. We allow these outside folks to influence our decision making instead of relying on whatever pre-plans or, incident response plans or whatever we've had in place, because we are panicking to a certain degree and we're just reacting. So it's sort of interesting. I bring this particular example from the fire service, and the reason I say this is interesting is that this happened 21 years ago today. This was an absolutely horrific fire in Worcester, Massachusetts. It was a cold storage facility, and it was a meat packing plant that was built in 1906. And it really hadn't changed a whole lot since 1906. It was basically vacant. We find out later on that it was actually two vagrants, that it was an accidental fire started by some folks who were living there, who obviously should not have been. But it was a maze of meat lockers. Now, why do I say that this involved reactionary behavior? Well, here's what happened. They got word there might be people trapped inside, these vagrants that I mentioned. So they send two firefighters in to go do a search to try to find these individuals. And they get hopelessly lost. In this maze of meat lockers, they have no idea where they are. And they call a mayday. And a mayday is supposed to stop all traffic on the radio and get people's attention so they can get help. So the fire chief says, okay, I'm sending in 2 more people to try to help the 2 folks who are lost and trapped. So he sends in 2 more people. Unfortunately, guess what happens to those 2 people? You got it. They too get lost and trapped, but nowhere near the first 2 firefighters. So the fire chief sends in 2 more people. He's reacting. He's scared, obviously. He doesn't want to lose his people. He does what we normally do in the fire service, and we want to get help and rescue each other. The problem is, especially when it's your own folks from your own firehouses that you know that you are more likely to be reactionary. Now, thankfully, and though he was persecuted for this initially, that fire chief decided after that 3rd pair went in to stop sending people in. And he lost all 6 firefighters. They all died in this fire. It was tragic. But it was in part because they hadn't done pre-planning, they didn't know the building well, and in part because the fire chief was reacting. And while it's not necessarily unexpected, it obviously had deadly consequences. Now, in incident response, while I mentioned it probably isn't going to be as deadly, we could have a situation where reactionary behavior could, you go running in after somebody in a dangerous situation, you could get hurt. But in terms of strictly incident response technical stuff, maybe, you've been asked to do forensics without a very clear goal because somebody's freaking out, oh, gotta look for the bad thing on the machine. Well, that's not useful, right? Or, oh my goodness, this machine's doing something terrible. We're just going to pull a network connection. Well, maybe you need to know more about that behavior before you pull that connection. And maybe if I just turn the machine off because, oh, the machine's doing a bad thing and I just press the button, well, maybe now, again, like the earlier example, maybe I've just lost the key I needed to decrypt the data because I've turned the machine off. Or maybe I suspend all the accounts because I'm reacting and saying, oh no, it's the end of the world, right? That can be problematic too in its own way. So these are all examples where in incident response we'd run into similar issues. Here's the 3rd challenge, and it uses a term we don't think of in incident response in quite the same way. But this is how I mean it here. So freelancing in this context involves people going off and kind of doing their own thing. They're not following chain of command. They're not following any sort of rules. They just go off and do what they want. And while it sort of seems like this is not something you'd see in the fire service, it happens all the time. People will just decide, I'm going to be the hero and I'm going to go up to the roof and start cutting holes, or I'm going to shove a hose in a window somewhere. This is significantly problematic. And you'll see that although when we in incident response typically think of freelancing, we're really, in most cases, that sort of terminology is really about folks who are consultants, right? So it's not the same kind of use, but we'll see this kind of freelancing that can happen in incident response as well. So these are my examples for the fire service, what I like to call crossing the streams. So the idea here is that somebody takes a hose line in the front door and another group of people take a hose line in the back door. What do you think happens when the hose line goes in the front door and another hose line goes in the back door, and especially if it's not a particularly large building? This does not go well. And you can have people who get injured. You could kill somebody. You could have all kinds of problems. And certainly, you're not going to be successful at the end goal of putting the fire out and saving property and lives, right? You might also have a situation where somebody, what we call, feeds a fire. So fire, one of the things that fire needs to burn, of course, is oxygen. And we can sometimes use airflow and oxygen starvation to put a fire out. That's what we do when we smother it. Let's say you have a kitchen fire, right? And if you've ever seen somebody that puts baking soda on a kitchen fire, or takes a pot lid and puts it down, we're smothering the fire. Well, we kind of do the same thing with the water. We remove the heat and remove the ability for oxygen to get to it. But, these are the things that fire needs. What happens if you feed a fire is you might have the fire started to bank down a little, it's not burning out of control anymore, and then someone breaks a window. And now you have all of this air coming in, right? So it's feeding that fire. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And I liken the crossing the streams to our favorite Ghostbusters down there. In incident response, we see folks do this too. We'll have somebody who just runs in and thinks they can collect all the things. And while that may not seem problematic at first, maybe you have a limited window to get items processed. So collecting all the things can be problematic there. Maybe they collect some things, but not the required things because they're not following whatever rules or steps that are in place or documentation. You can wind up with a duplication of data collection. You can get data, misrepresented or altered as a result because someone's doing something they shouldn't. So, not ideal. Now, here are some opportunities, some things that I've learned that I think are really good things to do, both in the fire service and in incident response. And the number one here is patience. Where slow is fast. I had an instructor that said that, with the idea being that when you take your time and you are deliberate in what you do, you ultimately will do things more quickly and more efficiently because you're thinking them through. So with this idea of patience, you want to take a moment and think about, is this really an incident? What's the best course of action? And if you take that moment, it can be a real difference. So I come back to the story of that fire, which was in this house. Is again the same house. If you look at the left-hand side, you'll see, of course, some smoke coming out. And you can kind of see there's some flame on that right-hand side of that picture. Now, if you took a beat and you look through that thermal camera like we were, you would know all of the heat is in the top part of that structure. It's not so much where you can see the little flame coming out, it's actually up in the eaves of that house. But the firefighters at that scene got very focused on running in to put the wet stuff on the red stuff, as we say, and did not focus on just, taking that beat and thinking it through. And so unfortunately, what we wound up with is the photograph on the right-hand side, where ultimately we start to see it, coming through the roof. Now, we did cut some holes, and some of that was done intentionally, but it took a longer time to put this fire out than it could have if they'd focused on where that seat of the fire was. So taking that beat could have saved some time. And while we might still have basically lost this house, we still might have had, some fewer issues with putting the fire out and put, fewer people at risk. So here's an incident response example. There was a breach involving a company called Chegg. And Chegg, and this was like millions of records involved. And what Chegg does, among other things, is they do textbook rental. So as you might expect, for a number of higher ed institutions, they had students who got their textbooks through Chegg. And what do you think the odds are that the credentials that were used in Chegg were the same ones at their institution? Bingo, you are correct. They were the same. So you had incidents where you had higher ed institutions who were basically freaking out over this breach as if it were their own. But if you take that beat and think about it and say, okay, well, I can educate about password reuse and there are things I can do about that. But when there's a breach and it's not of your own systems, is it really your incident? And do you need to follow through the same steps if it isn't? And it might be, in fact, that it is. But in this particular case, for most higher ed institutions, it wasn't our breach, it was Chegg's breach. And this was something that, yes, certainly needed to be dealt with and the credentials needed to be changed, but it's not the same scope, right? It's not nearly as damning. Also, time is important. but life safety is more important. So taking that beat in the fire service can literally be life or death. And as we've seen with tunnel vision, taking that beat when you're going into a room and you think all you're doing is going to a server room, but then you find out there's 6 inches of water on the ground, maybe taking that beat could save your life there too. And consider what the real risk and implication is of what you're walking into. Maybe it's not as awful as the person screaming in your ear is telling you it is. Another opportunity involves accountability. So accountability for the fire service really focuses on where team members are at all time. And we don't always think about this in incident response, but it's equally as important because we want to make sure nobody is, going to run into a physical hazard. We don't want folks stepping on each other physically or literally, duplication of effort. All of these things are very important. So for the fire service, we have what are called accountability tags. And you can see that on the left. And we basically, in our case, we have 2 of them, and one of them winds up on the truck. So we know what truck we came in on. And if something happens, they know what crew was there. And then for incident response, we often use, logs, right? Maybe swipe card access is sufficient. Maybe we need a physical paper log, which is the example you see on the bottom. But in both cases, accountability helps us know where our people are and what they're doing and can help keep us safe and keep us on track. And here's our third opportunity, pre-planning, because I know everybody loves pre-plans, right? Yeah, this is nobody's favorite thing to do, but it is so important. You need to know your environment. As I mentioned, that fire in Worcester, that was horrible. And it was partly horrible because they didn't know that environment. Nobody had been in that building in years, and they didn't know what to expect when they walked in the door. And in incident response, it really is the same thing. And yes, you might be an organization that's hired to come into an environment where, you don't know what they have, but at least you can ask questions. So pre-planning for firefighting looks something like this in many cases. So on the left, we have an example of, a hotel and a lot and it's difficult to see this, but the icons indicate like where a hydrant is, where there's water, where there's shutoffs, things that can help us be more effective. We have something similar. These are usually documents where we have, are there specific hazards? Do we need to worry about things that are part of building construction? So do we have things that could collapse? Where are the stairwells where we're likely to find people? Things like that. Well, in incident response, guess what? We've got ways to do this too. Obviously, any sort of incident response plan or team, documentation. So this is what I'm saying. If you're coming in from the outside and you don't know, at least ask what documentation do they have? Do they have network maps or server logs or physical like paper logs that tell us more about that environment? And oh my goodness, there are tabletop exercises now. And if you aren't familiar with Backdoors and Breaches by Black Hills, I can't recommend it enough. It's a sort of a Dungeons and Dragons type idea where you go in and you have somebody who is running the show and walks you through a scenario, and you have to make some decisions. And it not only helps you think about the kinds of problems you're likely to encounter in your own groups, but it also helps to see sort of where the holes are in that pre-plan and that documentation. Have you thought about with ransomware? I see all the time people say, well, make sure you have good backups. That's awesome. You should have good backups. You should be testing them regularly. But in the latest version of ransomware that's been going around, okay, let's imagine you just completely ignore the attacker and you just restore and you're good to go. And then the attacker says, oh, well, that's all well and good, but how about I take this data and I just publish it to the world? Okay, that doesn't help. Have you thought about that? Do you have a plan for that in advance? This game can ultimately, give you some insight about those kinds of questions in advance. So to sum up, what I would encourage you to do as an incident responder is to think more like a firefighter and keep these in mind. So avoid tunnel vision. Do what we think of as what's called a 360 of the problem. So when a firefighter and when a fire truck shows up, We typically pull past a burning building, and the goal of that is to see at least 3 sides of the building, and then somebody will later go all the way around because we need to know the whole picture, right? 360 of the building. You should act and don't react. It's very common to get led by emotion, whether it's your own or someone outside of the situation or somebody deeply inside the situation. Don't freelance. Have a plan and stick to it, which doesn't mean you can't, make changes as you need, but make sure you're sticking to, what you had in mind. And my goodness, have patience. Take what I call the beat. Take that moment before you proceed to think about what you're doing and how you're going to do it. Location is critical, right? Documented accountability. Where are you? Where are your people? Think about those things. And pre-plans, they totally rock, right? It's less chaos. The more you know, you have an easier, safer response. And consider something like an incident command system where, you have somebody that's kind of leading the show, and then you maybe have different groups underneath that are handling different portions of it, such that, only a few people respond up to one person at a time, and that makes that manageable. So some final thoughts. Not directly related, but I bring your attention to the organization Hacking is Not a Crime, of which I am a member. And the idea here is we have the same skills as attackers do, but our intent is totally different. This is the website if you're curious and want to know more. And I'd like to point out that great things don't come from comfort zones. And that's why I encourage you to sort of think beyond what you're comfortable with. Look at these firefighter techniques and see how maybe they can help you be a better incident responder. And with that, we can go to some questions.
Oh, that was awesome.
Thank you.
I like the comparisons going back and forth. And the incident command system is really, really useful. I've seen it in use in large scale like outages, for example, for even IT stuff. So like if it's a level 1 outage or 2 or 3 or 1, like you can bring in the right resources. If it goes over 24 hours, you know how to like just get people pizza and things like that.
Right.
You have someone dedicated and planned for it
Exactly.
as it scales.
Yeah, and you don't waste the resources that need to be dealing with the technical problems working on logistics, because you have people in place. That's their job: logistics, pizza, cots, whatever you need to kind of keep going. So yeah.
Got a couple of comments so far.
Okay.
This has been a great talk and very engaging. I love the use of backdoor and breaches to elicit some ideas and get the conversation going, especially with the eager and immature orgs.
Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah, and I mean there's some other tools out there, but that one's pretty inexpensive, and there's lots of documentation about it online. There are a number of, you can actually watch them play some of the games. There's even a Discord channel where people play for Black Hill. Like, there's so much out there. It's part of the reason I bring it up.
I keep hearing it's going to be a competitive card game at some point in time.
There is a competitive version already. Yep, there's a competitive version that at the last conference they had, they premiered it. So yeah, it's a thing.
Another comment was super practical talk, stuff many people know but do not implement.
Thank you. Yeah, and hopefully we'll see, more implementation. Just taking that beat and thinking it through, and yeah.
And otherwise, great session. So
thank you. Thank you. And I'm actively part of MISEC. I'm investigatorchic on the everything. So I'm on the Slack. So feel free to reach out, hit me up if you got questions, or shoot me a tweet or something. And again, I want to thank B-Sides Detroit and Converge for having me. And I will hopefully get to see folks in person at some point in the not too distant future.
Absolutely. And thank you for coming and speaking. So we appreciate it.
You're most welcome.
All right. And that's it. See you later.
All right. Sounds good.